You can unmute yourself to ask any questions. The purpose here today is really just to give an overview of what the Cupsaw Environmental Committee does. There's really two purposes here. Number one is we'd love to see more volunteers help us out with some of the day-to-day and long-term planning that we do for the lake. It really does take the entire community to make the long-term changes we want to see on the lake. Number two, for those of you who don't have the time or inclination to join the committee, it's always helpful to know what we're battling against so that as a member of the watershed, you can help us protect that watershed and keep our lake looking as nice as possible. So without further ado, I will jump into the presentation. Again, if you have questions, chat's probably the best way to get those questions out. I'll keep an eye on that as well. And if you need to, you can unmute yourself. I have muted everyone, but that's temporary. Oh, I covered that. So we'll also talk about our plan for this year as well, specific just to 2021. So first, let's go over the challenges for managing Cupsaw Lake. Our number one priority, it's a very technical term for lakes and limnology, but it's eutrophication. That is our enemy, and that'll be the primary focus here on our first 10 or 15 slides. First, a little background on the lake. What you see there is an old survey of Cupsaw Lake. The little lines inside the lake are depth contours, and that graph goes north to south. The north end is shallow. As you get down into the middle, it starts to get deep. Finally, it's about 30 feet at its deepest point on the south end. It's 66 acres. It was formed 75 years, maybe close to 80 by now, and it's run by volunteers. One of the challenges we have in the lake is it started out as a summer community, so a lot of the septic infrastructure, or just infrastructure in general, wasn't made for year-round living. That changed in the 50s. A member of this committee, Bruce Robertson, remembers seeing one of the first lights go on the other side of the lake. And it's been year-round since around the 1970s. Eutrophication, this is really the crux of everything we do for the lake. It's what we're most trying to prevent. There are other issues that pop up from time to time, but eutrophication is what's going to lead to the algae blooms. So if you look at that graph, there's really just three levels. At the top is let's not even go through the terms. It's a clear lake, a little bit dirtier, and at the bottom, eutrophic. Eutrophic means there's a lot of nutrients in the water, and that's going to feed algae blooms. Eutrophication is an unhealthy lake. The nutrients have built up in there. It can build up to the point where eventually the lake will or can die. So this is what we're always fighting against, what we're looking to prevent. We'll move here. So here's a nice clear lake. A good example of this is Sterling Lake up in Sterling Forest. It's clear though for reasons that aren't so good. It's an unhealthy lake in a way. It's got some heavy metals in it that keep the algae from forming up there. But that's a nice clear lake, something you'd see in an ideal mountain scene. And then there's a eutrophic lake. That's a lake that's got algae in it. It's got a lot of nutrients. And if you look at the fish on the right side, you'll see at the surface, they can get oxygen, but with all that organic matter in the lake, the bottom can go anoxic. And that's a big problem for our lake as well. And we'll get into a little bit of how we do our best to prevent that bottom layer from getting so anoxic and causing some bad issues for the lake. So a couple things between the two different categories of lakes. If you look at the middle column, something called a Secchi disc. This is a disc we drop in the lake, and as far as it goes down, we keep an eye on it till it disappears. If you're less than 3 feet, you're getting into a danger zone. Sometimes in the summer, Cupsaw Lake, you'll see readings as low as just under 2 feet, and we try to maintain that 3-foot level. In a clean lake, you'll see that go up to 12, 15 feet. To give you an idea right now, because it's early in the season, the water's cold, there isn't much growth. We're seeing Secchi disc readings in the 5 to 6 foot range, which is typical for this time of year. So controlling eutrophication requires addressing the causes as opposed to just the symptoms. So What we want to do as a committee is get ahead of what we do each summer, where we're just going after the symptoms. We're putting a Band-Aid on the problem, and we want a healthy lake that we can get rid of some of these causes. And it all comes down to nutrients. So Cupsaw has a conveyor belt. We enjoy and can sometimes be penalized by the high flow coming through our lake. At Cupsaw, you'll get a lot of rain that'll flow into our watershed. It's a large watershed that flows into the lake and goes over the dam. That can be helpful. If we have an algae bloom, it can help wipe that algae bloom out or at least dissipate it. But it can also be harmful. If our yards and septic systems and streets are not properly maintained and we don't have catch basins and things to catch the runoff, we're going to get a nutrient plume running into the lake, and that's fuel for algae. So that's really the conveyor belt we're looking at. Nutrient loading is the result. There's really two types of nutrient loading. But the nutrient loading we're worried about most is phosphorus. So phosphorus will vary from seasonally with higher amounts in the summer. So when we talk about phosphorus, we're not talking so much fertilizer anymore. That's been banned in New Jersey, and the most of the fertilizers you get. The phosphorus we're looking at can come from any source. It can come from detergents, washing your car in your driveway. If it runs out into the street and goes into a storm drain, that's like a nonstop highway into Cupsaw Lake. At that point, you're acting like you're lakefront, washing your car right into the lake. We measure these nutrients at different points in the inputs on the streams, and we know now we have a couple years of data combined with data from our professional sources that show us which streams are a little hotter than others when it comes to that. And we just received a borough report from Princeton Hydro. This was an expensive borough-wide report that made a bunch of recommendations. But ultimately, the result is our lake needs to go on a nutrient diet. We can't continue with our lake the way it is. It needs to get less nutrients flowing in and fueling these algae blooms. So you have a food web interactions real quick. Phytoplankton is a type of algae. It's a plankton, but it'll get eaten up, taken into the ecosystem by larger animals and eventually fish. Blue-green algae, which we'll get to later, doesn't follow that same path. So inside the lake, there's thermal interaction. So what you get in the summer is the cold water stays at the bottom of the lake. The top of the lake heats up, and you can actually get what's called a thermocline in the middle of the lake. This thermocline is a line across, usually around 10 to 15 feet deep, where the water could be 80 degrees above this line and in the 50s or 60s below it. Erskine, which has a deeper lake, I measured that last summer. They were in the 40s at the bottom of their thermocline, and the top of the water was close to 80. So it could really make a big difference. Part of what happens with the thermocline, though, is if you look at that dotted red line across the funnel there, the blue funnel, that's a barrier. Water below stays below, water above stays above. This is important because at both levels, animals are consuming oxygen. What we don't want is animals to consume the oxygen and not have the water get replenished. So if you're below that dotted line, eventually the animals run out of oxygen. So the cold water fish that are down there, they're going to need to come up to get their oxygen. Meanwhile, the bacteria we have in the bottom of the lake is going to, the aerobic bacteria is going to die, and then we're going to be left with anoxic bacteria. This is bad for a number of reasons. What you'll notice with your senses is it has a bad smell and can feed the algae blooms. What you won't notice, though, is it also, phosphorus is bound up in our soil. And when conditions go anoxic, especially with the amount of iron we have in there, it can release that phosphorus, release those nutrients into the water column and feed an algae bloom. So again, it's coming down to nutrients, nutrient prevention that we're looking for. So that's eutrophication is it. That is really what we try to battle year round, but especially in the summer, trying to keep the lake from getting too green and having the oxygen levels dip down to a point where fish could be affected. You could get a fish kill from those low levels. And of course, for swimming and recreating in the lake, we don't want a green lake. So each lake is unique, and there's experts out there all across the state and country that are dealing with HABs. This is not a uniquely ringwood problem. It's certainly not a New Jersey problem. They have a new HAB task force they put together. New York's been ahead of that curve for a while. And basically almost every state, actually every state I've heard of, is dealing in some ways with a eutrophication problem in their lakes. A lot of different answers. But what we try to do at Cupsaw is give those professionals information that's unique to our lake so they can treat it with the best available options. So let's take a look now back at the past decade and see what we've been doing. You get the 4 seasons of the lake. We're just coming into the productive season, spring, where curly leaf pondweeds growing under the surface, diatom algae will start to dominate the water column, and that's all good for now. So in the winter, and this winter, we had a pretty good blanket on top of the lake. That limits sunlight getting in. There will be some green algae as the ice recedes from shoreline that begins to develop. Diatoms do well in the cold water. And fish slow down, other animals burrow in the mud, they wait. Then we get spring. Spring is really when the committee needs to spring into action. Sorry for the pun. But what our first problem here, and different lakes deal with all sorts of different plants. I even have naiad on, if you look at the slide on the 3rd bullet point, as a plant, but really curly leaf pondweed is the one that dominates our lake each spring. It is why mid-May people will tell us the lake has never looked so bad, because what we're going to do is treat this curly leaf pondweed, which is a non-native invasive species. We're going to treat that with a product called Sonar, and that's going to float it to the surface. So you're going to have ugly mats of vegetation on the surface of the lake for about a month in different areas. And depending on the wind, it might blow into a cove and make the lake look really bad. Also during the spring awakening, we've had hundreds of mergansers feeding on the lake. Fish are getting destroyed everywhere. They are having themselves a feast. I've counted up to 8 or 9 blue herons. We got 3 cormorants, even an eagle and an osprey have visited already. So it's a very productive lake, and we're happy about that. But the fish or the birds keep that fish population in check. Also, the last bullet point, we have been using Sonar the last couple of years. There's 2 ways to treat this curly leaf pondweed. Reward kills it on contact, whereas Sonar gets into the roots and into the stem of the plant and kills it from the inside out. It's harmless to humans and animals. It only affects the chlorophyll process going on within a plant. So removing dead weeds is one of the first things we ask volunteers to come help us with. What you see in that picture is Alan with an old invention. It's corrugated, I don't want to say aluminum, something corrugated on top of wood. Alan, you can put it in the chat if you want. But what it does is allows you to put the pondweed on top of a canoe without swamping yourself. So the water runs off the side of the boat and you can get a pretty nice pile going. Plexiglass, oh, it is in there, all right. Geese activity, our goose activity picks up this time of year. Right now, we're only dealing with 1 pair of geese. That's because we have a very active group already working on it. They're working in the water through boats. They're working on land with dog patrols. And we've partnered with one of our members is part of the Humane Society. So since 2012, we have not had to kill any geese. Although if the problem gets really bad, we would always consider that as an option, that we bring that up to the board. But we've gone about 9 years now without having to do that. We have 1 pair that calls Cupsaw home. I don't blame them. It's a nice lake, but all the itinerant geese that come through have been able to be chased away pretty quickly. Now comes summertime. It's the busiest time for the lake, both above the surface and under the surface. It's also the prime time for algae. So when you get this time of year, when the water is below 70 degrees, diatoms are dominating the water column. It gives the lake a brown appearance, but diatoms are great. They're the base of the food chain. They're feeding zooplankton that feed up all the way up to the biggest fish we have in the lake. But during the summer, as the water temperature starts to hit 70, 75, 80, cyanobacteria, also known as blue-green algae, gets a competitive advantage. This is the stuff we don't want. This is the nutrients we want to keep away from the algae. We don't want the algae to have a buffet in our lake. So this here is a picture of Cupsaw Lake from a few years ago. It's a typical bloom. You can see the green with some bubbles. The trouble with the blue-green algae bloom, and the reason we need volunteers keep an eye on the lake every day, is it can double every 4 hours. So you're looking at in 24 hours, exponential growth. And that's what we're trying to prevent. So we need to get the management team in here quick, the professional management team, to treat the lake. Last year, we tried to stay ahead of it with different treatments I'll talk about in a few minutes, but it's really our #1 enemy. So there's just a quick look at what the diatoms look like. They're those glassy shells. It's like a silica cell. And down below is, I don't know, those might be different types of blue-green algae or cyanobacteria. But again, those diatoms are good. Aerobic bacteria are pretty good. Oh, that's what they are, it's labeled. But the blue-green algae is really what we don't want, and we don't want anaerobic bacteria, which happens when the bottom goes anoxic. So preventing the system, this is what we've been working on most recently. This picture actually has some blue dye in it that we don't have budgeted this year, but we keep in mind. Some of the things we've done to prevent it is alum. What alum does, and we used this a lot last year, is alum binds itself to phosphorus. In other words, alum binds itself to the nutrients and drops it out of the water column. This is something pretty important for us to keep the algae, those nutrients away from the algae. It's one of the few weapons we have that's preventative, besides what we'll talk about, which is protecting the watershed. What also helps, we've done some blue dye before, and you may have seen some water movers in different parts of the lakes. Keeping the water moving works against the cyanobacteria. It wants to move up and down in a peaceful, quiet water column. It has the ability to do that. So with water movers or keeping the water circulating, you sort of prevent its natural advantage over other types of algae. Some other things we've tried and will continue to try. We have a rain garden at the lake, and we're working and would love help to try to get more rain gardens in people's yards. As soon as water leaves your yard and hits a storm drain, it's in the lake. It's on a highway. There's nothing stopping it. It's a direct route to the lake. So there may be 90 or so lakefront houses, but really all the houses in the Cupsaw watershed are lakefront because of our excellent storm drain system, excellent for keeping our roads dry, but not excellent for funneling everything directly into the lake. So what we try to do is let's go upstream and try to reduce the nutrients. We can do that through rain gardens. Rain gardens aren't meant to capture all your nutrients from a rain event. They're meant to capture the first quarter inch of rain. It's sort of that scouring rain that cleans the surface. That's where we want puddles to form. And then if you get another 2 inches of rain, you're not going to get as much nutrient load at that point. So rain gardens will often be shallow with a pipe out of it. So they can catch a quick shower at the beginning of a storm. But then when you have a full torrential rain, it'll direct the water out because there's only so much you can hold in a garden. Septic education. We would love more ways to attack this. We've done it through social media on Facebook. We've created some bulletins, and we're just looking to keep that going to get people to properly maintain their septic system. Not only will you benefit the lake, you'll benefit your pocketbook, because if your septic system fails, you'll go to sell your house and you may end up with a $20,000 to $40,000 bill. And those bills aren't getting any cheaper as time goes on and the rules change. We also have aeration in the lake, and we'll talk about that a little more. Basically, what aeration's doing is it's creating a stream of bubbles at the bottom of the lake to turn the lake over, to break that, what we were talking about before, that thermocline, so that the whole lake can stay oxygenated. Eventually, some lakes consider dredging them to get rid of all that nutrient that gets stored in the soil beneath the lake. Some of our other summer concerns, E. coli is a constant concern, although we are very low. Our counts have traditionally been in single digits, where I think it's around 300 or so in the new count that would trigger a second test and a possible closure. So the town comes here once a week to do that. They say 1 or 4 geese are equal to 1 septic system. So geese can heavily impact these readings. So we keep an eye on their population for that reason, as well as keeping the grounds pretty clean. And then a heavy rain can just cause a plume of everything to go in the lake, and that would include some E. coli. So we might see a little bit of a rise in E. coli levels after a heavy rain, but so far in all our testing, it hasn't been a concern that we have to to work with. Occasionally you get some small leeches here or there. They might attach to your foot. It's been a few years since we've had that as a problem. And then you get aquatic plants along the shoreline. It's again helpful to have volunteers to control these aquatic plants, because if we can have a team pull them by hand, then we don't need to use chemicals like we do for our curly leaf pondweed. Cattail has been a recent success at controlling it, to the point where we now have a few groves that we allow. Here's one of them, a few groves that we allow to remain for scenic value. This one happens to be at Turtle Island. There's another grove that we're allowing to grow right by the paddle wheel. But again, if it's left uncontrolled, it could begin to take up the entire shoreline. And eventually, because it'll capture nutrient runoff, which is a good thing, but it could extend itself further and further into the shallow areas of the lake. So we also map the different areas of cattail. This map's about 2 or 3 years old. If you look at the balloons with the blue balloons with the red square in it, those are different areas of cattail that we have marked, and sometimes we'll remove them, sometimes we'll leave them. Again, it depends on the homeowner. Now we'll take us into the fall. It's really to the committee, it's never ending summer. It's algae blooms can continue all the way into November. We have seen north of us, we've seen Shepherd Lake closed by a bloom in October, and we've seen other lakes get closed by an algae bloom, a harmful algae bloom or cyanobacteria in November. So even though the swim season ends on Labor Day, we may do a treatment in September, but after October 1st, we're done. So the lake is left to run on its own. But what will happen in the autumn is, as the lake cools, the diatom can once again begin to establish itself and compete fairly against the cyanobacteria. I'll use those terms interchangeably. It's cyanobacteria and blue-green algae. Those are our the two big ones. Lowering the lake, I think we're due for a lake lowering this year, because it's an odd year, and we've been doing it every other year for about maybe 6 or 8 years now. Lowering the lake can benefit weed control in some ways. If the shoreline's exposed during a hard freeze, it can affect the buds that are, we'll just say the seeds that are overwintering in the lake bottom. And the anoxic water, or the water at the bottom of the lake, is always going to be worse than the water at the top. It's just the stuff falls to the bottom. So one nice thing about Cupsaw is our dam valve is at the bottom of the deepest point there. So we do get rid of some of that water we don't like in the lake. So when we drain our lake, the environmental committee, at least from our perspective, we do look at it as a positive, if not a neutral, but certainly has some benefits for the lake, as long as we don't lower it too much and affect the wildlife. Something we do a lot of is take lake measurements. This allows us to identify trends. As good as some people's memories are, we have found that having the data in a spreadsheet eliminates a lot of the uncertainty that can develop in the human mind. So some of those that we take the Secchi disc measurement, dissolved oxygen, to make sure that we have oxygen down at the bottom of the lake. So we have aeration going to keep the oxygen high, but we're going to measure at least once a week during the summer to make sure that the aeration is doing its job. If for some reason we have a very still summer and there's just not enough oxygen to go around the lake, we may have to shut off the aeration and let the thermocline develop. We look at the temperature in the lake. We do measure some phosphorus numbers from streams. The towns measure in E. coli, and we also track the different animals that come through the lake. This is mostly in some people have concerns that certain species have left the lake, so we keep an eye on that. Here is the Secchi measurement slide. You can see the picture there. Must be cold, the person's wearing gloves, but usually we'll be out there in warmer weather. So that's the disc. It's a black and white disc so that you can see it. You drop it down, you record when it disappears, and it's really that simple. We have 2 people that currently take Secchi measurements. I'm a third who takes them occasionally, but certainly not as often as I'd like. These numbers get put into a spreadsheet. We can chart the data and see what the trends look like. We can also use Secchi measurements and communicate with our lake management professional to let them know if we see a problem coming. Oftentimes you'll see it in a decreasing Secchi measurement, and sometimes that decrease can be like a cliff. You can have 3 feet one day, 2 days later it's down to 2 feet. That's a 33% reduction. And that's when we call in the the vendor to come take a look and do his professional thing. So here you just see a quick example. It goes deeper in the clear water. In the cloudy water, you're not going to go as deep. This is our actual DO meter, and we throw that in there to take a look at the oxygen levels. If you look at the second bullet point there, you'll see our magic number, which is 3 milligrams per liter. If we fall below that, then down towards the bottom, then our system may be either not powered up enough or just we're not getting enough oxygen mix at the surface to make it worth mixing all around. So we keep an eye on that. If when the number starts to drop, we might call our aeration vendor to come out and clean things if they haven't done that in a while, or at least to do their own testing to confirm the numbers we're seeing. Here's an example of DO measurements taking, I think this is 2018. So we measure the site, we take it, and what you'll see is date, time, and then temp and DO every meter. So we track it. If you look all the way to the right of the spreadsheet, you'll see some numbers at 9 meters. That's 27 feet, give or take. And you'll see, maybe on May 20th, we got a low reading. We start up the aeration, and then you get numbers in the 5s. That actually looks like a pretty good year, but at the very bottom of the sheet, you see in July, we see lower numbers. Also, those numbers are away from the aerators. Since then, we have moved. This data helped us know to move some of our diffusers north, away from just the dam area. This is the Cupsaw watershed. Not everyone lives in it. There's some areas south of the lake and southwest of the lake that drain straight into the reservoir. But our watershed stretches all the way up into New York, up by the Seven Sisters convent, I think that is up there. You have Shepherd Lake in our watershed, that entire botanical gardens, which can be a concern somewhat. They have a lot of plantings going on up there. I think it's Defiance Mountain and Warm Puppy Rock, but it's a really big watershed. And then, of course, when you get into the area closer to the lake, those are all our homes that are within the watershed. If you look closely, you probably can't see it on a phone, but we have a couple of red dots there to show the intakes. This is a better view of those intakes. Those blue dots show all the different areas that we have water coming into the lake. Some have higher flows than others. And we do an analysis, lots of analysis, actually. We have a team that looks into this, but this is just an example of different points that they would take pictures of the storm drains, as well as not in this. Here you'll see some of the areas where you'll actually will get a water sample and test the phosphorus. So if you see the A, B, and C, which is really just working up from the lake, you might be able to find 2 of them have low levels, but something upstream or downstream has a higher level, and you can narrow down where to look. We've found some interesting things, including a broken water main by looking at this type of data. Septic systems deserves its own slide. We'll send out more information about this. Keep an eye out on the Cupsaw Watch Facebook page if you're on social media. We'll try to get another thing out through the Cupsaw email blast. But septic problems in Cupsaw Lake area are over 50% of our nutrient loading. So we have to be careful not only to properly maintain our septic tanks, but we need to be careful with what we put in there as well. Because eventually everything in the septic tank, except for this sludge at the bottom, makes its way out through a leach field and eventually into the groundwater and on into the lake. These are just some of the animals that we'll see at the lake. You got a kingfisher, mallard, a Canadian goose, that's a cormorant, the blackbird. Down in the bottom left is a heron. We haven't seen a swan yet this year, but last couple of years they've just been coming and going. So we track those as well. This is an example of the animal tracker from 2018. It's a little early in the year to start tracking them, but if you notice at the bottom of the spreadsheet, and we're there now already, usually mid-March, the geese come back, whether or not that lake is thawed. So now we'll roll into what we're looking at for 2021. Goose control is already underway. We have a dedicated group from the Humane Society or Humane people. They are great at picking up the goose droppings. It's really a benefit to the whole community. If they didn't do that, that bottom slide is what 2 geese will do to our clubhouse. So they are out there all the time picking up, well, they're called the poop patrol. So that's what they're picking up. And in the meantime, we do harass them so they don't feel comfortable. Eventually geese molt, and they will only molt somewhere where they feel safe. We don't want them to feel safe here. As we talked about before, curly leaf pondweed is a problem this time of year. It's gonna really explode at the end of April. I'm seeing some of it in the lake already, but April is when you'll see mats of it on the surface. So what are we gonna do? We're gonna treat it with sonar, that'll kill it. And then we're going to send teams out in boats or along the shore. The more curly leaf pondweed volunteers can remove from the lake, the less chemicals we'll need to dump in the lake to inactivate it this summer. Here's my kids and wife. I dragoon them occasionally into helping clear out some of that weed. This is probably curly leaf at this point. They're in their things. Don't worry about the dam flow. It will not suck you over. It's actually, if you could see the picture there, it's pretty shallow right by the dam. Blue dye application is something we keep in the arsenal. It's costly. It's pretty expensive for us to do for the whole lake. We first used it in 2017 when we had a terrible blue-green algae outbreak. In 2017, we first used it. 2018, we applied 3 rounds to stay ahead of it. 2019 and 2020, we moved to alum, which inactivates phosphorus as opposed to the blue dye. And I don't know if I explained it well, but blue dye is, the reason we put it in the lake is not to have it look like a Caribbean island. We put it in the lake to block sunlight from getting to the algae. So algae needs 3 things to grow, but the 2 things we think we can control, number 1 is the nutrient load, but number 2 is the light. So when we put blue dye into the lake, it's really to keep the light beams from getting down and feeding even more algae. It's not budgeted for this year, but we will keep it ready to go. And that'll be when I go to the board and beg for some more funds to keep our lake looking good. But again, it's sort of a treatment of last resort, although not the worst treatment we try to avoid. So here's an overall view of aeration. The top level is where you see that thermocline developing. In this case, it's a dark blue line. So you have a fish habitat there, just above the thermocline. It's not looking good at this lake. The surface is green. It's going to be a little smelly. You got some weeds growing on it. And then underneath that blue area, that's the dead zone. That's where there's no oxygen, nutrients are being released, and fish can't live down there. It's clearly a slide made by, or the picture is made by a company that sells this stuff, but doesn't that bottom picture look nice? That's what we're trying to do with the lake. So we're keeping the oxygen levels up at the bottom of the lake so that we keep the nutrients locked in and we give the fish a little more room to swim around the lake. Again, the 3 milligrams per liter is our magic number. When it goes below that, we may take, we will most likely take some type of action. Alum was really, we believe it to be a big part of our success in 2020. We began, instead of applying alum once or twice a season, we started applying alum every 2 weeks. So when they come here, they put the alum in the lake, it binds to the phosphorus, drops it out of the water column, making it unavailable for algae. It will settle in at the bottom of the lake and alum will lock it in for a while. Some of the problems we get though is when we put alum in the lake, we don't want to have a heavy rain the next day because it'll wash out a lot of our expensive alum right over the lake. So we want to try to be ahead of that. We'll check with our vendor. If we need the treatment and it's a light rain, we may tell them to go ahead with it. If it's a heavy rain, we may tell them to hold off for a few days, depending on the situation with the lake. Come end of July, early August, it's really tough to make any adjustments in timing. Last year was the first year we tried a sonic device. We put it in right after the tropical storm. It was running on a generator at the beginning. The way sonic works is sort of like an opera singer in a wine glass. It'll work by vibrating a proper frequency to break air vacuoles within cyanobacteria. They're actually looking into sonic as a possible treatment for COVID-19. So it's been used in a lot of different medical areas as well as many lakes. Our system is very small. New Jersey gave a $500,000 grant to Echo Lake to try a more robust system. The trouble with sonic is it's the cyanobacteria can get used to the wavelengths. You may actually create your own unique algae bloom or cyanobacteria bloom because you're discouraging one species, but the nutrients are still there. So if there's a species that your frequency doesn't cover, it's going to thrive because you've just taken out its competition. So we are going to be very careful with using it this year. It's a treatment that we may not start until we have a visible cyanobacteria problem. Copper sulfate, it's the bright blue chemical coming out of that hose nozzle. Copper sulfate has been a mainstay in our lake for 50 years. Copper is very effective at killing cyanobacteria. Unfortunately, it's very effective at killing everything else too. It will kill all sorts of algae, including diatoms. So if we are midsummer and we're looking at a lake that's 50-50 diatoms and cyanobacteria, we are very hesitant to use copper because what it's going to do is those diatoms that have been hanging on, and diatoms are a good algae, they're going to get wiped out by the copper as well. So a week after we wipe out the algae, the cyanobacteria will get a competitive advantage and could possibly be 80–90% of the water column as far as the algae in the water column. So copper is very effective, but it's also it's a treatment of last resort. We got lucky last year. I think we had effective alum treatments, but we got lucky with the weather. We had a lot of wind. We didn't have a terribly hot summer, and the wind helped keep oxygen levels up on the surface, which allowed aeration to work better. And without having a huge summer heat wave or drought where water completely stopped over the dam, we're able to keep the lake in a better balance. So weather is still the #1 factor when it comes to controlling our lake, but when the forces work against us, we will use copper sulfate, and if I can get the budget, I will throw in blue dye after the copper treatment. Our vendor really likes that as a 1-2 punch. So let's take a look at some of the algae we'll see. I'm no expert on cyanobacteria identification, so this one I would call into our professional manager and say we got blobs. But you can see the green around the blobs too. That's sort of a pea soup appearance. Then this we typically see later in the season. This shot is probably from September, about 5 years ago. This is more of what they call spilled paint. This is algae that sort of congeals on the surface. No one likes this. If I see this or the vendor sees this will be a copper treatment. You can get a harmful algae bloom. This is the very beginning of one. It's a floating mat of algae that sort of got on its own. This year, in 2020, this past year, we actually had a targeted treatment, a new treatment that we use for a floating mat of algae. So we're hoping this year to use the same type of strategy where we have alum keeping the algae away. And then if we get a little tiny, and I say tiny because this is maybe 30 feet, 20 by 30 feet, this can get knocked down by a chemical that really attacks it right on the surface as opposed to dragging it through the entire lake. I put this slide in here because this is what really concerns me this time of year is when I see these types of bubbles coming into our lake. I don't like it. Something seems to be going on. If you have a leaking septic system, or some people, to protect their septic system, might have a washing machine that doesn't even go through septic and just goes straight out into a different waterway. I don't like seeing these bubbles. When I see these bubbles, they just mean nutrient loading to me. So if you see something like this on the lake, you happen to see it, feel free to send us an email or even let the town know, because the town will look into a leak like this. It was actually a leak in the fall of 2017 that caused them to look at our lake and then go look up at Shepherd Lake and found out they had a problem up there. And I always throw this in as a joke, but wildlife has been known to steal a boat or two around there. Plays better when you're not all muted. Anyways, so that's the environmental committee. So we need you. Well, why do we need you? We need you because if we have a cleaner watershed, we'll use less chemicals. If we hand remove the weeds, we won't need to, we'd be removing nutrients with the weeds. And our cattail management program has demonstrated that we can control an invasive species without needing to just always apply chemicals on it. We don't want chemicals in the lake. We want to avoid that as much as possible so that the lake can develop its own healthy ecosystem and process this stuff on its own. A healthy lake will be able to absorb much of what puts in it. We just happen to be overloading it at the moment. So it does take the whole community to do it. You saw that picture before of the entire watershed. So ultimately, decisions on the lake are going to be made by our professional management company. We pay them a lot of money to do this. They do their tests, and it's up to them. But we give them the daily input because there's only so much they can see on our lake coming once a week, or sometimes once every 2 weeks. So we have to give them these numbers. We are the eyes and ears for them, and then we let them make the decisions on how best to treat our problems. Here's that watershed picture again. I can't stress it enough. If you see something, you smell something weird's going on, please reach out to the borough. They will send a health officer to inspect. If it's a leaking septic system, somebody's yard smells like sewage, that's a time to contact our borough health officer. Also, storm drains, you want to make sure that we don't have dirt or some massive influx of nutrient, which could be plant matter, leaves. Let's keep those drains clear. Rain gardens can be helpful in everyone's house. I'd love to see us get a volunteer group that will eventually work with, we have resources from Rutgers. They have a whole group that does master gardener class. I took a Rutgers class last year for environment, but there were some master gardeners there. This is their expertise. If you as a homeowner or one of your friends is interested in helping with a rain garden, send us an email at environmentcommittee@cupsawlake.org, and we'll put you in touch with people that may be able to help you design that. There's even some grant money out there for homeowners to put together a rain garden. And again, we can coordinate with our Rutgers Extension office to go ahead and get a project like that started. More specifically though, our little rain garden at Cupsaw Lake itself could sure use a master gardener or someone to take full charge of it. Unfortunately, when it just becomes a sideline for the environmental committee, we tend to deal with the worst problems, and rain garden gets pushed to the bottom of that list. Another thing we could look for is a response team. Occasionally we do get a major event on the lake, and dealing with it quickly can really make a difference between a small fish kill and a large fish kill. Because as fish are dying, we've had 2 fish kills in the time I've been keeping track of things, 2 major ones. And the sooner you can get those dead fish out of the lake, the better for the lake. So during a major one in August a few years ago, we were out there in boats getting all the dead fish out of the water. Not only does it help the smell of the lake, but it'll help the ecosystem improve better. We also occasionally, we've had to deploy a boom by one of the streams when we saw some weird stuff coming out of it. So, if you're interested in volunteering, but you don't really have the time, you could be on an emergency response team where hopefully we don't call you ever, but maybe once a year, once every other year, there might be a big enough event to cause that. Another area we're looking to improve is our capital improvements. So we're looking to get volunteers to maintain the paddle wheel, help us utilize water movers. Cupsaw owns 2 of them. And at the end of the year, we need to winterize this equipment. And the sonic devices as well require a bit of maintenance. So if you're mechanically inclined, please let us know. There's always other opportunities if depending on what your desire is. If you're on the lake a lot, you can be taking lake measurements. I know I got Alan down to the lake every morning for about 8 years. It's a good healthy activity to go out for a walk and get down to the lake. We can also use help managing the treatment company, staying in contact with them. Goose control always needs volunteers, whether it's picking up poop, bringing your dog down to the clubhouse. Please keep it on a leash though, but bringing your dog down to scare the geese into the water. Weed removal, we'll be coming up to that real soon. We got about a month till those weeds start presenting on the surface. So we'll want to do our best to take as many out of the lake as we can. We have talked about grant research. Alan was a big part in getting the borough-wide grant, and we'd like to now take that grant. That should give us enough ammunition or research to then apply for grants to actually start making a difference and putting in some stormwater management techniques. Lastly is area cleanups. This could be a light thing where a group gets together. We have Cupsaw cleanup day, but maybe more than once a year, just go clean some garbage off the dam. It's built up there right now, actually, at the edge of the shoreline and any other areas. We can keep our streams clear. We'll keep that stuff from coming into the lake. So that's about it for this introduction to the Cupsaw environment. First, I want to thank you. We had more attendance than I expected tonight. That's a great thing. It's really the first step, and I appreciate you coming out to learn more about the lake. And for those of you interested in continuing volunteering, you can leave your email in the chat. You can email us at environmentcommittee@cupsawlake.org, and I'll show that on the next slide. There we go. It's a long email. So I'm going to go ahead and open it up to questions. Everyone is muted right now. And before I start with that, I see we did get one in the chat, and it's about promoting home water conservation efforts. Yes, that would be very helpful. I think that would be part of a larger let's conserve or let's septic effort, because that home water is going into the septic systems. And yes, I mean, there's ideas for home water efforts, like don't do all your laundry on a Saturday morning. So you're going to shower, you're going to do laundry, and you're going to clean everything up. And what you're doing is sending a flood into your septic system. That can not only send it out of your septic system through the leach field, but it can actually clog your leach field. If your septic system is getting close to full or something, a big flush of water all at once can wash some of that particulate into your drain field and clog it up. And that can be real expensive to change that drain field. All right, I see everyone is muted. Is that up? Tanya, I see your hand up. You are unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, how are you doing? Thank you so much for this. We just moved to Cupsaw this summer, and this is all great information. I think my husband, who's also listening, and I are definitely interested in volunteering, so I will email you. But I also wanted to know, can you send this presentation out? Because I have a dad who is an environmental conservationist in Harriman, and he would die to see this. He would absolutely love to see this.
Yes, Tanya. So I'm happy to send the presentation. I'll look forward to getting your email if you can remind me in the email.
Absolutely, yeah.
But yeah, I'd love to send it out, and love that. Alan's bigger at this than me, but we love having contacts at other lakes. The idea of us, Alan and I are both members of NJ Cola, and Alan's actually been in contact with the New York Federation up there. So yeah, send me that info. I'll share this presentation. I have a longer one if, you know, when people have beers and stuff, it's a little easier to get it all in. But yeah, I'd be happy to. And if he has any questions, also happy to talk about any of the problems we've seen or the way we address it.
And as far as volunteering, and I guess I could iron this out in an email, but would we be able to discuss what jobs we would be best at?
Yeah, that's really what I'd love to do is take what your interest is and match it to what we do. Like, I love kayaking, so I end up chasing the geese on the water. It's a win-win, and I want to try to, as best we can, create win-win situations for everyone. So if there's a very specific thing, it's perfect.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much again for this. This was awesome.
You're welcome. Thanks for attending. Somebody asked in the chat, what do we do with the dead weeds? We bring them to the town, and it just goes into the town dump. So the recycling center, basically. So it's collected as part of their organic matter. The weeds, unfortunately, there could be a concern with copper uptake, but hopefully a lot less this year since we didn't use it last year. But the weeds can make great fertilizer. They are nutrient heavy. So, but in general, we've talked to the town about it. So we bring it down to the town dump. So we let the weeds dry out. They're incredibly light once they dry out, and that makes them pretty easy to move. All right, that's all I see in the chat for questions. Anyone else have a question they want to ask? No? All right, we'll go. Alan, do you have anything that you want to add that I forgot there? I'm going to ask you to unmute. It should pop up on your screen now. the old Zoom mute.
How about
Here we
that?
go.
Hey, great job, Tom. I've seen presentations from a number of scientists, but I think you did as well as anybody, including Dr. Steve Sousa. So great job, Tom.
I can't say the word oligotrophic, so I have to go with clean. But other than that, yeah, maybe. Well, thanks very much. Thank you, Chuck. Great. Well, thanks again for joining. Please leave the slide up, and I'll mute myself here in a minute, turn my video off, but I'm going to leave that slide up for anyone. Feel free to go ahead and email me and at environmentcommittee@cupsawlake.org. We have our first meeting next Monday at 8 p.m. We're going to discuss different roles that we take. We are a very active committee. I've reached out to over a dozen people already. And at any given point, I'd say at the end of the year, we have over 30 people that do join us. So thanks again for joining, and look forward to seeing many of you during the course of the year.